You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Ben Franklin's World is a production of Clio Digital Media, and support for this episode comes from the Massachusetts Historical Society, the first historical society founded in the United States in 1791.
Rather than see the Articles of Confederation as this foolish misstep that the Constitution helps correct for, as this sort of curiosity, this blip that happened, but it's just a small footnote. We should instead recognize that it provokes the central debate of all of American political life, whether at the end of the day, the United States is a whole and the parts are subordinate to that. You know, the states are real and they exist and they have certain privileges and authority. But at the end of the day, the United States of America picks out a single indivisible thing defined by a single legal, political, cultural entity called the people of the United States. Or is the foundational premise of the whole thing that there is this sort of reserved space of local control, and the whole was created by the parts, and the whole should be subordinate to the parts. The Articles of Confederation is the first and a very crucial chapter in that debate that never goes away, and is the debate that is prosecuted with great ferocity on the eve of the Civil War. That is exactly what they're talking about. And it harkens back to the days of the Articles of Confederation and what it did or did not do and how the Constitution did or did not change them.
Hello, and welcome to episode 445 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. On July 2, 1776, 250 years ago this week, 12 of the 13 colonies voted to accept the first part of Richard Henry Lee's Virginia Resolution. Quote, that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is, and ought to be, totally dissolved. End quote. Now, 2 days later, on July 4, 1776, Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence, the document that told the world why the 13 British North American colonies were breaking away from Great Britain. But as we've discussed over our last two episodes, declaring independence and achieving independence were two very different things. Now, Lee's Virginia Resolution called not just for independence, but for three elements of independence: a Declaration of Independence, a plan for forging foreign alliances, and a frame of government that would allow the new United States to exist as a sovereign, self-governing nation. In episode 443, we explored the Virginia Resolution and the pressure applied by ordinary people that pushed Virginia and the rest of the colonies to declare independence. In episode 444, we investigated the Model Treaty, a template United States diplomats could use to forge foreign alliances, not through military alliances, but through trade agreements. And today, we turn to the third element of independence, the Articles of Confederation. On June 12, 1776, Congress appointed a committee of 13 with one delegate from each colony to draft a plan for Confederation. John Dickinson of Pennsylvania chaired this committee, and it fell to him to draft this initial plan. Now, this is the same John Dickinson who disagreed with the timing of independence. He thought that July 1776 was way too early for the colonies to make this move, so he absented himself from that important vote. But here he was on this committee, drafting the plan for how the new independent nation would govern itself. So what type of government did Dickinson draft? What happened to Dickinson's draft when the full body of Congress group edited it? To help us find answers to these questions, we're joined by two scholars. Jane Calvert, the founding director and chief editor of the John Dickinson Writings Project and the foremost expert on John Dickinson, and Jonathan Gannap, a professor of history and law at Stanford University and one of the leading experts on the origins and development of the United States Constitution. Now, during our exploration, Jane and Jonathan reveal why 13 very different and fiercely independent colonies agreed that they needed to come together in a formal national union, how John Dickinson's draft Articles of Confederation imagined a strong central government that look very different from the central government that the Second Continental Congress created and then sent out to the states for ratification. And what the dispute over Western lands had to do with why it took 5 years for the Articles of Confederation to finally go into effect in March 1781. But first, if exploring the founding era's big, tangled questions fires up your curiosity, then you belong in the History Explorers Club. The History Explorers Club is a virtual community for curious adults to explore, discuss, and indulge in early American history. No scholarly background is needed, and we'll applaud and thank you every time you bring up a cool historical fact. Now, club members get access to live historian talks, workshops, and a 24/7 forum where you can ask questions and discuss history. And right now, in honor of the 250th anniversary of the United States, we're running a sale. New annual members get 3 months free. To learn more about the club and to join, visit historyexplorers.club. That's historyexplorers.club. I really can't wait to see you there. All right, are you ready to explore this third element of independence, the Articles of Confederation? Allow me to introduce you to our guest historians. Joining us are two guests. Jane Calvert is the founding director and chief editor of the John Dickinson Writings Project. She's the foremost expert on John Dickinson, having studied him for more than 2 decades. Her research has been sponsored by many leading historical institutions and archives, including the American Philosophical Society, the Library Company of Philadelphia, the Newberry Library, and the Huntington Library. Jane has written 2 books about Dickinson, Quaker Constitutionalism and the Political Thought of John Dickinson, and, most recently, her award-winning Penman of the Founding, a biography of John Dickinson. Jonathan Gannap is a professor of history and law at Stanford University. He's an expert in the origins and development of the United States Constitution. Now, Jonathan's extensive knowledge of the constitutional history of the United States has led him to serve as an expert witness, a writer of amicus briefs, and a guest speaker on podcasts like All Things Considered and Ben Franklin's World. He's written 2 books on American constitutional history and interpretation, including the award-winning The Second Creation, Fixing the American Constitution in the Founding Era, and, most recently, his second award-winning book, Against Constitutional Originalism, A Historical Critique. Welcome back to Ben Franklin's World, Jane Calvert and Jonathan Gannap.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Let's set the scene. On June 7, 1776, Richard Henry Lee presented the Virginia Resolution to the Second Continental Congress. Now, we remember how this resolution famously resolved that these united colonies are, and of right, ought to be free and independent states. What we forget here is that this resolution also directed Congress to forge foreign alliances and, quote, that a plan of confederation be prepared and transmitted to the respective colonies for their consideration and approbation, end quote. Jane and Jonathan, could you tell us why you think that Virginia thought it was really important that the Second Continental Congress not just declare independence, but also prepare a plan for the states to unite in a confederation under a single government?
Well, Virginia was hardly the only colony that thought some plan of confederation was important. In fact, this had been something that had been in the works to one degree or another for at least a year. And earlier in the previous summer, in July of 1775, Benjamin Franklin had an earlier draft of the Articles of Confederation that he put forward for debate. This was on July 21st, I believe. And Dickinson at the time actually nixed any discussion of it. But yeah, it was understood by everybody that if the colonies were going to become independent, they needed a government to replace the one that they were overthrowing, namely the British government.
Yeah, there are a number of reasons that I think are worth underscoring. So first and foremost is, why would there be a union and confederation? And I think it's important to stress that even if a lot of colonists were naturally attached to their individual colonies, there was a clear recognition that they were not going to be able to secure their independence unless they came together, if only to coordinate what was probably going to be, in fact, absolutely turned out to be a very complicated, complex, draining war effort, that needed some kind of coordination across the colonies in order to secure independence and make it a reality. Now, the second question is, why go through the work of formalizing a plan of confederation or union rather than just say, we have this thing that we're calling and others are calling the Continental Congress. It has sort of de facto standing. It's doing things of its own accord. Let's just continue on and worry about the formalities later. I think there are a number of reasons why it's really important to accompany independence with a clearer establishment of what the union is and will be. One, because it will really help from the standpoint of international legitimacy. If it's going to be extremely important to secure foreign alliances, it's really going to help that endeavor to signal to the world that the United States of America is not doing things ad hoc, but is taking seriously this project of replacing sort of one form of sovereign political authority and replacing it with something else. And in addition to that, there's a recognition that this will help formally unite and establish the union, not just its legal basis, but also its political and cultural basis. It will make it clear through sort of a more intentional set of activities that Americans are consciously doing something that is going to fill the void of the British Empire. This is worth asking. It's hard to find people who had more to do than those working in the Second Continental Congress in the summer of 1776. You might imagine a scenario in which they say, it would be nice to have Articles of Union, but we're going to focus on that when we have a little bit more time. But in their minds, it's really connected to the project of independence. Independence isn't going to work as easily, both externally facing and internally facing, unless they do this.
And to add to Jonathan's point about showing union, cohesion, Americans were really anything but united on the eve of independence. I don't have numbers at my fingertips, but it's debatable whether there was even a majority of Americans who wanted independence. There were a vast number of people who were loyalists. There were people who were indifferent, and there were people who were officially neutral. So there were very real issues with prosecuting a war in the first place, for which you really should be united, but also keeping the various factions from sort of going after each other and attacking each other when the umbrella of the British government was no longer over them. So if they could get some sort of a union that could help with those things, potentially.
Now, to what degree do you think the Second Continental Congress actually wanted to create a union? Because when we look at the history of British North America, some of these colonies have been together for over 150 years at this point. So they had a lot of chances to unite in these earlier period, but they never did. And it also seems like with prosecuting the war for independence, that there were plenty of states who were happy to do their own thing as long as they could still access this mutual military aid when they needed it. So to what extent do you think the Second Continental Congress was really into creating a federal union? And why do you think they finally decided to create this formal union? Do you think it was the push for foreign aid and recognition? Or do you think the colonies were just convinced that if we're really going to make a go at being an independent nation, then we need to be united and have a single government and provide that mutual aid, whatever it is, whenever we need it?
So certainly the international context is crucial here, but at the same time, I think we need to recognize the extent to which a number of people, especially in the Congress, are seeing the importance of people imagining connection beyond individual colonies. So for instance, they'll say, well, why did we care that Britain cracked down on Massachusetts, Boston, New England the way it did with the Coercive Acts? To a great many people, that was understood as an attack on a sister colony, an attack on one of us is an attack on all of us. We've sort of increasingly pledged our commitment to each other. People are beginning to think, even if they have not detached themselves from a lot of local prejudices to their own governance, they are seeing connections across colonial lines forged through the common experience of dealing with British intrusion into those. And out of that, a lot of people in the Second Continental Congress in particular, not everybody, but a lot of them are really stressing the importance of thinking like Americans, as many of them even say, that there's a larger project at work here that deserves people's attention and emotional affinity. And That's by no means a settled matter. That will be the basis for a lot of disputes of exactly what that means. And if being American or being united in not just a sort of loose alliance of independent states, but of something tighter than that, whether or not that interferes with local governance will be a great source of debate. But nonetheless, you see a lot more people speaking in those terms about at least the aspirational desire to see across colonial lines. And that's a big reason why I think people are beginning to think of union anew as not just something instrumental, but as something that is sort of bound up with what the revolution is about.
Yeah, just to follow up on this idea of American identity, this was kind of a creation of John Dickinson's in his Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, which he published beginning at the end of 1767 and the beginning of 1768. Before this point, Americans really only saw themselves as connected through Britain. And he kind of planted the seed, as farmers do, for Americans to think of themselves as first and foremost Americans with a distinct American identity, and that they should unite on that basis. And Americans, they really liked the descriptions that they saw of themselves coming from his pen. And he made them sound really great, selfless and courageous and magnanimous and virtuous in all the best ways. And so they glommed onto this. And this is the idea that was kind of carrying them into this venture of independence. So it was an ideal and an ideology. But on the other hand, in a very real sense, the colonies were in no sense independent states. Before they had been connected by Britain, they were about to destroy that connection. They could not function independently. They were, first of all, intimately bound up with the mother country, and they needed something to replace that cohesion, but they couldn't function independently in relation to one another either. And so in order to actually survive, they were going to have to cooperate. So there were both sort of high-minded, idealistic reasons for uniting, but also just very practical necessities that demanded that they unify in order to survive, not just internally to not sort of kill one another, but against foreign invasion, or not just to throw off the British Empire, but to keep the French or the Spanish from attacking them or any other sorts of outside forces. So yeah, there were many things kind of pushing them in that direction.
The founders, especially when they issued these big resolutions or declarations, they seemed to be very careful with the language they used. And the Virginia Resolution, the Lee Resolution, says that Congress should make a plan for a confederation. It doesn't say write a constitution. So could we talk about what a confederation was and is, and how the founders understood confederations and why they may have picked the word confederation instead of make a constitution?
Sure. Terminology here could be fluid, but by and large, what a confederation tended to underscore was a league of friendship between otherwise autonomous, sovereign, independent political entities. So as opposed to a federation that had more consolidated power and then distributed it between different parts, or a unitary nation state that had fully consolidated power, a confederation was a way to create a union without the member states parting with crucial areas of their own sovereign control. So it was usually emphasized to have particular features such as the parts make the whole rather than the whole is making the parts. And the individual parts here, what would be, the colonies turned states of the United States, would enter into this voluntarily. And in so doing would not sacrifice any of their individual independence or in many instances control over their own internal affairs. Now, exactly whether all confederations that sort of fly under that label require sort of the exact same understanding of what the states retain or don't becomes a source of dispute, especially as they begin drafting the Articles of Confederation. But that had been sort of the general outline of what confederations had been across history. And when those who were participating in the Second Continental Congress were sort of drawing on the crucial political and legal literature of the time, especially that laid out in the Law of Nations writers like Vattel and Pufendorf and Hugo Grotius, it really emphasized how confederations were sort of systems of states how independent states with sort of independent sovereignty could come together for certain purposes without necessarily delegating all of their sovereignty.
I'd like to stress that there was sort of a continuum of thought between the sort of extremes that Jonathan was mentioning. To the extent they were thinking about it, I mean, that was part of the problem, is that they weren't necessarily articulating what they meant by Confederation when they were talking about Articles of. And you see that Dickinson had one idea that was more or less shot down by people with other ideas. And so it's sort of interesting that although I think there were some people, again, like Dickinson, who were thinking about sort of the big questions of the locus of sovereignty, the old question of imperium and imperio, of a state within a state, where should power lie? The idea was that there could not be a state within a state, that there had to be one sovereign power. And although I think that that was certainly in some people's minds when they were drafting the articles or debating the articles, they weren't really articulating it yet. And so there was just a lot of confusion about what they meant and what they were after and how they should achieve it. And there were assumptions that some people were articulating and others were challenging, and other things that just weren't articulated at all. So it was really kind of a mess for a good number of years until they finally realized it was so much of a mess that they needed to do something about it. And hence the Federal Convention happened. But yeah, it was very much up for dispute about what they actually were after and what the issues of sovereignty actually were.
Well, let's talk about the work of drafting these Articles of Confederation. So within days of Lee introducing the Virginia Resolution on June 7, 1776, Congress appointed committees to undertake the work of the resolution. So Congress created a committee of 5 to draft the Declaration of Independence. It created another committee of 5 to draft the model treaty or a plan for foreign alliances. And it created a committee of 13 to draft Articles of Confederation. Jane, Jonathan, 13 sounds like a large committee. So can we talk about why other committees were 3 to 5 people, but the Articles of Confederation committee needed to have 13 members?
Well, they obviously were sort of looking to make the colonies each feel as though they had agency and were making a contribution to this because they wanted unanimity on all these big issues. And that was the way to do it. It certainly had the potential to be unwieldy. And I think it would have been if they all had been participating, but they weren't. And unfortunately, it is virtually unknown what happened in that committee because there are just almost no records. The only records we have are Dickinson's notes and drafts, and then a couple of just sort of random comments by people who were on the committee. We don't really know exactly what went on, only that Dickinson more or less was immediately given the leading role. He took it upon himself. Personally, I think one of the reasons he nixed Benjamin Franklin's version in July 1775 was because he wanted to write it himself. So I think he very much embraced that role because he had very specific ideas about what he wanted to include. And so who knows how many people showed up to the meetings, and maybe it was sort of like the typical group project where like, oh, let's just let Dickinson do it. And they just all like went their separate ways and let him take care of it. Who knows? In that case, I don't think they'd have a whole lot to complain about, but complain they did anyway. So yeah, I think it was just buy-in from all the colonies.
Yeah, I think Jane hit the nail on the head. First of all, it was never going to be an actual drafting committee. And this is true throughout the entire founding era. Committees are put together, and then there are implicit or explicit delegations to de facto subcommittees of the committee, in some cases to committees of one who do the primary job of drafting. But the point of the committee is, from a formal standpoint, to make it very clear that any draft that emerges from committee will have the imprimatur of a representative from every colony, soon to be state. And that would be really important because that would signal state equality, which is a sort of crucial feature of the early construction of the United States. Does every state have an equal say? And this will especially ensure that larger states that have more population, more wealth, won't have an outsized view of what the Articles of Confederation will say by constituting the committee this way. It will also help ensure what everyone seems to recognize will be essential, that for these Articles of Union to become the legal basis of the United States, they will need to be ratified by all of the separate states individually. And it's much easier to do that if every state had a representative on the committee. But from a practical standpoint, whether that's just people saying, we're busy, you take it, and we'll check back in once you've done something, or if there's a kind of clear, conscious recognition that one or two people need to really be driving the train here, the multi-member committee becomes a much smaller, if not a one-person committee, very quickly.
That's a good point, Jonathan. Jane, would you tell us how John Dickinson became the leader of this committee, and how it was decided that he would write the initial draft of the Articles of Confederation? Because when we talked with you about Dickinson in episode 258, Dickinson really seemed to be the black sheep of Continental congressmen because he chose to take a stand and not vote for independence. He didn't want independence in July 1776. So everyone in Congress knew that Dickinson was not going to vote for independence, but somehow he became the leader of the committee charged with creating a new government for an independent United States. How did that happen?
I mean, I think you're absolutely right that we see him today as the black sheep. But at the time, he was seen as the leader. Certainly less so by this time. But in the First Continental Congress and through the Second Continental Congress, really until just that spring, he was the undisputed leader of Congress, and folks followed his lead. He was revered as the author of the Farmer's Letters, which we spoke about. He had also written the two productions of the Stamp Act Congress. He wrote 4 of the 6 productions of the 1774 Continental Congress, and he wrote the 2 most important documents of the Second Continental Congress thus far, which were the Olive Branch Petition and the Declaration on Taking Up Arms. He was incredibly revered as a statesman. People respected him. They respected his long career as a statesman in both Pennsylvania and Delaware. And he was a lawyer, of course, one of the most highly trained lawyers in the colonies. And he was just a superb writer. So it was really kind of a no-brainer. And in fact, a fun counterfactual speculation is that if he had been in favor of the Declaration of Independence, there's really no question that he would have written it. Thomas Jefferson was a relative unknown compared to Dickinson. So anyway, it was not a strange thing that the reins of the committee would have been handed to him. And he'd been really thinking about constitutions in depth for a very long time. He was really a constitutional scholar at heart. So yeah, that's why people would have deferred to him. And he was also on the committee to write the model treaty, which was, as you mentioned, a 5-person committee. He actually did the foundational work in that committee as well, but it's really sketchy compared to what he did for the articles. The articles drafted and agonized and edited, and he did a lot of work that we have the result of. Whereas for the Model Treaty Committee, there's some really sketchy notes and they're really hard to read. And then he more or less just handed them off to John Adams, who then built on his work.
Jonathan, what were the founding generation's ideas about government? What did they think a good government should look like and be able to do? Because on a real practical level, if they declare independence, they have to form a new government that is capable of seeing them through as a new nation, because governing the colonies was a function that Great Britain had performed. So the founders have to create something new to sustain this new nation. So as the founders embarked on this committee to create a new government, what were their top concerns for their new government?
Yeah, so declaring independence abrogates a lot of existing government in the United States. It doesn't wipe the slate clean, not least because Americans are firmly committed to the idea that they're revolting in the name of and in defense of the customary British Constitution rather than against it. So they think there's a whole set of fundamental legal protections and rights that stay in place, but their institutional guardians and how governance itself will be structured and function on a day-to-day level now needs to be reestablished or remade anew. Now, this mostly happens at the state level, where they're replacing what had been their colonial governments with new state constitutions. And there's an enormous sort of outpouring of creative debate over that. The question of union and confederation, though, implicates a particular kind of question that is of urgent concern, will arguably become the most important sort of constitutional and political question for the coming decades of the United States, if not up to these days that we live in now, that is not central to the project of state constitution making, which is the matter of federalism. How will power be distributed between some central authority in the United States and the local state authorities? And it is only really in drafting the Articles of Confederation, in putting together the Confederation and thinking about union, that question that will be so central to the remaking of the Articles in the U.S. Constitution and its debate for decades to come is brought front and center. And here they have a lot to think about. One is they have just been in a federal union where apparently things have really gone awry. So what is it about the British Empire as a negative example? Its distribution of authority between center and periphery that needs to not be replicated. How do they think about that? They talk about how the Act of Union of 1707 that had brought Scotland into Great Britain, an incorporating union because the Scottish Parliament was dissolved and became part of the British Parliament. Sort of another negative example because the local authority swung too far in the direction of centralized authority. They spent a lot of time thinking about other confederations, both ancient and modern, from ancient Greece, or more recently, the United Provinces of the Netherlands, or even the Swiss cantons, which were sort of loosely allied republics, and trying to think about whether or not they afford any useful examples. And then they have all of this theoretical literature that sort of talks about how relatively independent states can come together for certain purposes without necessarily sacrificing all of their sovereign control over their local affairs. So these are not relevant considerations in the same way when they're drafting the individual constitutions of the states that implicate all these big questions about Republican liberty and what kinds of institutional safeguards, whether it's having a strong executive or no executive, whether you have two houses of the legislature or one, whether you have the judiciary that does anything or not, whether you declare rights or not. Those are all front and center with state constitutions. But that real question of federalism, center and peripheries, the whole and the part, how they fit together, really comes through in the drafting of the articles. And it becomes clear very early that exactly how you draw these lines and put these pieces together, people don't agree. And in part, they don't agree on the underlying premise of what even are we as the United States of America. Through the act of debating Dickinson's draft, a lot of people begin emphasizing that if you really get down to it, what the United States is a single constitutional unit, because the Declaration of Independence was done together, not individually. And Dickinson is very sympathetic to that view that will be defended by a great many of his allies like James Wilson and Benjamin Rush and John Adams and others who say, we declared independence together. The whole came before the parts are not creating the whole. So even if this distribution of authority between center and periphery, a lot of things are going to be left to the states. We're going to recognize the importance, privileges of the states. Nonetheless, this central authority needs to have a certain kind of muscular authority to protect the broader general welfare because Americans are in this together. On the other side will be the idea, no. What came first? The parts came first, and the whole is what we're creating through the articles. And the central principle here has to be that any central government we create isn't really a government. It's more a league of friendship that will have no authority whatsoever under any circumstance to interfere with the internal affairs of the states. And what's so interesting about the drafting of the Confederation and the debates that are immediately provoked over it is that it immediately draws those fault lines. And you start to see who is thinking of America in more unitary terms and who sees it as really something more like the modern European Union. And that debate is front and center in ways that are interesting.
Another thing that was implicit in what Jonathan was saying is that it's not just how people are imagining what they're going to be doing going forward, but also how they view what they were leaving. So I would say probably the majority of the people in Congress, they had a pretty negative view of Britain and everything to do with Britain. Dickinson was not one of those people. And I think there were probably others who shared his view. And what that view was, sure, there were problems. There were problems with executive power. There were problems with parliament, with ministers, with corruption, with all of the things that had put America into the situation it currently was, needing to declare independence. But Dickinson had a great love for the British Constitution, and he saw it was really good for his colony of Pennsylvania. Being under the umbrella of the British Constitution allowed the Quakers in Pennsylvania to craft a really unique constitution for Pennsylvania that gave religious dissenters more liberty than they had anywhere else in the British Empire. And it was because of the existence of that Pennsylvania Constitution under the protection of the British Constitution that Dickinson had fond feelings for the British Constitution and was interested in replicating that and in pulling in those salutary aspects of the Pennsylvania Constitution to make these really basic individual rights, give them the same protection that they had had in Pennsylvania during the colonial period. So yeah, I don't think it's a coincidence that Dickinson was one of the best trained lawyers and that he had this affinity for the British Constitution. One other thing I'll say about that is that there was very much a sense as we get sort of down the road in the Confederation period where it's plain that Americans have just wanted to throw off everything of the British Empire and were very much interested in kind of a sense of negative liberty of where we want to be left alone to do without any kind of government interference. And that was just fundamentally sort of not how Dickinson and people who shared his priorities saw the purpose of government. Government could also play a very important role in positive liberty of allowing you to do things that you wanted to do.
You've mentioned a lot of inspiration and ideas that Dickinson had about what a good constitution should look like. But how did that translate into his draft, Articles of Confederation? Jane, would you tell us what Dickinson's draft looked like?
It had a number of really unique provisions. Well, they were risks that he was willing to take. The biggest thing that we should talk about is how he envisioned the role of Congress and the central power in relation to the states. And he was very clear that the states were not to be trusted and that they should be subordinated to a central power. That's not to say he was in favor of consolidation, not by any stretch, but he just thought that the main thing was the union of the American people, that the states had to defer to that central power. That was the means for survival. So he wrote that in, and then his provisions reflect that priority. So that's the big overarching thing. But then the most unique provision within that structure was the biggest provision he put really way up at the top. And that was a provision for religious toleration or liberty. It was really both. After independence, he wanted to be sure that individuals living in the respective states would have their religious toleration or liberty frozen where it was during the colonial period, so that maybe they couldn't necessarily gain more religious liberty very easily, but neither could they be deprived of any religious toleration or liberty that they already had. The way he did this was when he was drafting his version of the Articles, he had a copy of the 1701 Pennsylvania Constitution open in front of him, and he just copied almost verbatim the liberty of conscience clause in the Pennsylvania Constitution into the Articles of Confederation. And I say almost verbatim because the changes he made were really, really important. So in the Pennsylvania Constitution, it used language, no person or persons who profess their religion peacefully shall be molested or prejudiced for his or their religion, so on and so forth. Well, he started to write that, and then he thought better of it. And you can see where he changed his mind as he was drafting. He scratched out his or their religious persuasion or practice and changed it to his or her religious persuasion or practice. In doing so, He added in the first gender-inclusive language for a fundamental right that had existed in any Anglo-American constitution. He also included religious persuasion or practice. And the word practice is really important there. He had gender-inclusive language and the word practice because Quakers were the only religious group who allowed women to be ministers. So Quaker women would travel around and they would preach in public. So he was making sure that Quaker women in Pennsylvania would retain both their religious liberty and their freedom of public speech. So these were rights that were unheard of anywhere else and actually not even fully articulated in the Pennsylvania Constitution. And here he was writing these things in. So I have long said that this was the most revolutionary moment of the revolution, that women would have their basic liberties written into this Constitution. Of course, it, along with his other novel provisions, it was excised from the final draft, but he tried at least.
Just to build on what Jane so nicely said there. So, one thing the draft does, which we should underscore because it's easy to take for granted, but perhaps shouldn't be, is that it vests unconditionally and unambiguously essentially all powers of foreign affairs, war, and peace in the United States government. And we might imagine if people are committed to the idea that they're individual states that will be in the plural declaring independence, retain to themselves full sovereign control, then why doesn't Pennsylvania or Virginia or Massachusetts have the right to establish its own foreign policy, to create its own treaties with European powers, to fully consider questions of national self-defense? The Articles of Confederation, as Dickinson drafts it, makes it very clear that all of those external-facing issues of governance that concern the United States as a whole will run through Congress. So that's a very big statement. And then when it comes to internal governance, certainly recognizes, as was almost certainly necessary at the time, the individual authority of the states when it comes to representation. Each state will have equal representation. The states that have more population and wealth will not have more say in Congress. But, as Jane was nicely alluding to, makes it very clear that even if the states will retain their existing laws and customs to the extent they would like and control over them in their internal police for the most part, allowed to in any way, shape, or form interfere with the Articles of Confederation, which, depending on how you interpret it, could be a meaningful check on internal governance. And it seems by implication from the draft to fall to the central authority to make the determinations on when that has happened. So in this regard, not only is it giving a lot of power to Congress from an external foreign affairs standpoint, but the potential authority of Congress to second guess what the states are doing internally is also far beyond what others might be willing to tolerate. So on two different dimensions, it has a nationalist impulse.
So the Articles of Confederation that Dickinson drafted included women when it came to religious freedom. It included a strong national government vested with very important national powers. And it mirrored the British Constitution a little bit because Dickinson thought that that was a good form of government. Plus, in the margins of his draft, Dickinson also questioned whether Congress should abolish slavery in the Articles of Confederation. Now, Jonathan, you mentioned earlier in our conversation that there was debate over this draft constitution, and that's something that we should really explore. But first, let's take a moment to thank our episode sponsors. Friend, Ben Franklin's World has been going on for nearly 12 years, and it's always been a community effort. Right now, we're in the midst of our annual fundraising campaign. Between now and the end of July 2026, we'd like to add 50 new donors. And I can't think of a better moment to ask. We're in the 250th anniversary year of the Declaration of Independence and the birth of the United States. A moment when the questions that this podcast is always asked feel more alive and needed. So if you've been thinking about supporting this podcast, now is the time to do it, especially if this show has become part of your routine or you found yourself going down a historical rabbit hole with lots of open books and browser tabs because of a conversation you heard in an episode. Please consider supporting us. 50 new donors by the end of July, that's our goal, and we need your help to do it. And if you've already given to Ben Franklin's World, a return gift is most welcome. Thank you for your consideration. Now you can make your first gift or your return gift in any amount at benfranklinsworld.com/donate. That's benfranklinsworld.com/donate. Every gift keeps this work going and our conversations freely available to anyone who wants them. So thank you so much for listening, and thank you so much for caring about history and for your help in helping us to tell it. And a sincere thank you to Donald G., Phil G., Annette G., William G., Lynn G.P., Robert G., and Luce G. or Lucha G. for your generous support. Thank you. We couldn't do this work without you. If you're looking for something fun to do to commemorate the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, be sure to check out the Massachusetts Historical Society's new exhibit, 1776 Declaring Independence. Now, the centerpiece of this exhibit is the Society's original John Dunlap broadside. This is one of the first printed copies of the Declaration of Independence. The MHS also has a lot of other versions of the Declaration on display, including a remarkable vellum version that John Quincy Adams had made in 1826 for the surviving signers of the Declaration. This exhibit runs through December 19, 2026, so if you're in Boston, I highly recommend to visit. Jonathan, what happened when John Dickinson handed his draft Articles of Confederation over to his fellow committee members and then to the full Continental Congress? What do we know about the debate that ensued over Dickinson's draft?
It provokes immediate debate, which again is striking. That one perspective could be they debated the Articles of Confederation so little. I think the better interpretation is, given the war they're prosecuting and so much going on, how amazing that they debated it as much as they did. They immediately zero in on the sort of central questions of representation. A whole bunch of people who come from the larger states want to push the draft even further. They don't want representation to be based on the premise of equal state sovereignty, where each state has an equal say in Congress's deliberations. They would prefer for it to instead be based on land or head, so in terms of number of persons, though that implicates the thorny question, as will happen at the Constitutional Convention, of slavery. There's also the matter of Western lands, which is a huge issue. Who will have control over Western lands? Because a number of the states have Western land claims, the so-called landed states, and a whole set of other states don't, so-called landless states. And a lot of the landless states are really worried that states like Virginia and others that have these land claims, if they're not forced to part with them, that this will be a source of ongoing power and will allow them to dominate the states that lack these claims. But there's also this central matter of what exactly is meant in Dickinson's draft by the states retain control over their internal police, except in matters that violate the Articles of Confederation. And this becomes very concrete, less so in the summer of 1776 when they are formally debating the draft, and more in the early months of 1777 when the draft is sort of lurking in the background and they haven't finalized it. And it's when a series of issues, concrete issues, emerge on the ground that implicate this question of, does the central government have authority to interfere in state affairs in particular ways? And the individual who really presses the envelope here defending state prerogative is a new arrival at Congress named Thomas Burke from North Carolina, who becomes the architect of the eventual Article 2 of the Articles of Confederation that dramatically rewrites what had been Dickinson's understanding of the relative breakdown of power between the states and the central government. There are many debates here, but the one that has always most fascinated me is over the question of desertions from the Continental Army and whether or not the Continental Army can track down deserters and punish them without going through the intermediary of the state government in which the deserter is being pursued. And the argument here in defense of this policy is James Wilson, one of John Dickinson's allies who believes in a stronger national government, says, regardless of what the Articles of Confederation says, we already have this sort of implicit, unwritten Constitution of Union that divides up the subject matter of governance based on continental concern and local concern. So all issues of a continental concern, anything that implicates the broader general welfare of the United States, automatically falls under Congress's jurisdiction. It doesn't matter if an issue of continental concern happens very locally, like a deserter running around within Pennsylvania's borders. Desertion is a problem that threatens the Continental Army and therefore the whole war effort and is therefore continental. The Continental Army and Congress don't need state permission to pursue a policy of how to deal with deserters. Thomas Burke immediately pushes back and says, no, if Congress can capture a deserter within state lines and just decide whether or not this person is or is not a deserter without appealing to the protections found in that particular state's constitution, the issue here is not what to do with deserters. The issue here is how do you ascertain whether or not someone accused of being a deserter is one? Thomas Burke says that's essentially the end of the state constitutions and the end of state governance. No, you need the permission of the state governments. You need their help. And it is based on this debate where he really sees in his eyes what the Dickinson draft might portend. He sees James Wilson and others actually putting meat on the bones of this abstract premise of what it would mean for Congress to say, no, there's a whole subject matter of legislation that falls under the Articles of Confederation that the states can't interfere with, how this might impact local state governance. And it is after these debates that he pushes his revised Article 2 that makes it very, very clear that the states will retain their sovereignty, freedom, and independence, as he puts it, in all areas that are not expressly delegated to Congress, this new language that he adds. But to me, this is really the most interesting feature of the debates over the Dickinson draft, not least because they are brought forth by these are concrete issues of governance on the ground. And James Wilson and others, I think, are doing a good job of defending Dickinson's vision of saying, yes, for the United States of America to be a real thing, it must have the capacity to govern over issues that affect the whole nation. And other people saying, no, we really want this to be much more a league of friendship where the national authority has very little authority to tell the states what to do about its internal matters.
One way to sort of look at the big shift here from Dickinson's version in 76 to what became the ratified version in 1781 with Thomas Burke's significant change is that Dickinson sort of saw the central government acting kind of as an arbiter of the states that were at each other, disputes between them, and that he'd seen in the past and he saw in the future, and that actually did materialize. But then Burke's reconfiguration saw basically the states and the central government as being the ones who were kind of at each other. And so it's just an entirely different conceptualization of the power structures and dynamics. So Burke was the guy who kind of came in kind of out of nowhere and revised this. And just to go back for a second, Dickinson wasn't a part of the debates about the articles after he wrote them. The first debates took place in July and August when Dickinson had joined his battalion and was on the front waiting to engage with the British in New Jersey. And then the next debates happened in the spring and fall of 77. And again, Dickinson had actually joined the Delaware militia as a private and was busy serving in that way. And also he was not in Congress. He did not resign. He was voted out by the Radicals of Pennsylvania, who sort of didn't want him after he didn't vote on the Declaration. So in any case, Thomas Burke is that key figure who sort of changes the whole conception of the Articles.
So after this debate, the Articles of Confederation went out for the approbation of the states in November 1777. And as Jonathan just mentioned, the document that the states received was a government structure that kept a lot of power within the states themselves. So the new federal government, the Articles of Confederation, would not have the power to tax, and any laws or changes to the Constitution would have to go through unanimous approval in order to pass. So it was a very different type of government than the one we think today associated with the United States Constitution. So Jane and Jonathan, how did the states react to the Articles and to its government? Who was really quick to ratify this Constitution, and which states took a little bit longer to think this union through?
Yeah, so a lot of the states that have Western land claims ratify it very quickly. They're happy that Congress is not going to have clear control over that issue, and they're willing to tolerate whatever compromises or concessions went into it. Plus, there's surely a recognition that we're in the midst of a difficult war that, depending on the exact date we're talking about, is not going particularly well. It's good to have a plan of union. This one's been hammered out. Let's start there. But a whole set of states that don't have Western land claims put their foot down, and they're quite frustrated by a number of features of the document, but especially that one. And no state is more frustrated than Maryland, which issues a formal statement almost 2 years after the Articles of Confederation have been sent out for consideration, stating that it's never going to ratify the Articles unless the so-called landed states surrender their Western territorial claims to the federal government. And it's only when Virginia is willing eventually in 1781, in this curiosity of the Articles, it's finally drafted and finished in 1777, not ratified until 1781, near the end of the War for American Independence. Only when Virginia, the state with the largest claims, is willing to cede them, at least its claims north of the Ohio River, to the public domain, that Maryland is finally willing to sign on to the Articles. So however one interprets that, that does emphasize that however united Americans have become through the Revolution and the war, there are these deep issues of local state interest and concern about who's going to hold power going forward and what will be the basis of that power that suggests that there's a lot more work to be done to ensure that they're truly united.
Yeah, and some states like Delaware, in 1779, Dickinson was back in Congress, and it fell to him to be one of the delegates to actually sign the Articles of Confederation, to ratify it. And he did, but like other states, I'm sure he held his nose and sort of signed it because it was better than nothing. And then immediately, I think even as he signed it, said that he wanted it amended. And he continued calling for it to be amended when he was president of Pennsylvania. And so, yeah, he never stopped calling for that, knowing how weak it was.
I wonder if we could talk about the Western land situation, because as you mentioned, there were states like Virginia, New York, Connecticut that had these colonial charters that gave them the right to a lot of land. And then you, of course, had states like Maryland that had no Western land grants because their charters were written to confine them to just a small slot of land. So why were Western land grants such a concern for a state like Maryland who didn't have them, and for states like Virginia that did have them?
Few things were potentially going to be a source of greater economic power. I mean, especially if a big impetus for the American Revolution had been frustration that the British had prohibited settlement beyond the Appalachian Mountains, that so much had been poured into that kind of colonial expansion. And there were enormous riches to be made. And if certain states could be part of that windfall and other states would be completely shut out of it, well, then where does the balance of political power lay once that's done? And what are the future prospects of different states if that's possible? What does it really mean to be united if certain states have such disproportionate amount of influence and power of that variety? Not just the existing discrepancies between size and wealth, but ones that could prove astronomical in the future. It's a very concerning, foreboding picture that the smaller landless states are facing. Plus, it's not just that this saves them from being under the thumb of a place like Virginia. If these Western land claims fall under the broader custody of the United States, then they will have a share in it. They can benefit from it in ways that they would say, why does an arbitrarily drawn up charter from a long time ago that was essentially made up? Why do we need to honor that now and essentially cripple our future when we should be thinking anew about how to share these possibilities?
These issues, though, they were not at all new. They were just really coming to a head with the question of independence. But they had been issues that had been present throughout colonial history. And of course, we're fully aware of the westward push and the tensions that created with Native Americans. There were land speculators and settlers who were constantly pressing westward. And there was a particular issue between Connecticut and Pennsylvania up in what's called the Wyoming Valley. And it was basically Connecticut settlers were pressing westward, and Pennsylvania land speculators were likewise going forth and trying to make their fortunes. And they clashed, and there had been a series of wars that erupted between these two factions up in this territory. And it had been an issue since I think the 1750s into the 60s. And then they continued to flare up so that in the 1780s, there was a really vicious civil war with people fighting and killing each other. Even as the revolution was ending, Americans were actually killing each other. And so it would be really handy to have some sort of central power in place that would somehow act as an umpire between these groups. Kind of all came down to money and power.
Something I think we forget in our own modern time is that a lot of the state boundaries we recognize today were not yet set and settled in 1777. And of course, states like South Carolina and Georgia, Massachusetts and New York, Connecticut and New York, there are others. They may actually need to use the Confederation Congress's ability to mediate between the states to settle their border disputes. In fact, I know South Carolina and Georgia had to make use of this function. Now, Jonathan, I believe you said at the start that on June 12, 1776, the Continental Congress created a committee to begin the process of forming a new government. And then, as you said, Maryland became the 13th and final state to ratify the Articles of Confederation into existence in March 1781. So really about 7 months before the Siege of Yorktown. How did the United States govern itself between this period where in 1777, the Articles of Confederation go out for the approbation of the states, and March 1781, when Maryland finally ratified the Articles of Confederation and put the Confederation Congress in charge? How did the United States govern itself without an official government?
Yeah, one of the interesting features of American constitutional development that is often not properly appreciated is, as people recognized at the time, Americans do things backwards. You imagine drawing up a government and then governing under it. They don't do it that way. And they don't do it that way because of practical necessity of needing to coordinate an independence movement and then prosecute a war. So at the time they begin thinking about an Articles of Confederation, the Continental Congress has already been around a couple of years. And through that activity of actually governing, you create a lot of working assumptions about how the governance of union works, which help create or tap into a kind of unwritten constitution of union, which becomes quite essential when they think about what actually should be in the Articles of Confederation, because for a lot of people, you're ratifying things you have learned through the process of governing up to that point. And then because the Articles of Confederation aren't actually formalized until 1781, you are living that reality in a very big way. And a lot of what Congress is understanding is both from the standpoint of what can we do, what can the states do, what will the American public accept, is this ongoing conversation and negotiation of legitimacy, of doing things in such a way that it constantly has the sufficient support of the states and the people that it can work. And to me, this establishes a really important set of habits and precedents going forward that are not washed away when either the articles are finally ratified or replaced by the United States Constitution. That sort of unwritten constitution of federal union is the precise thing that has always been in the background and continues to inform how we do lots of things. And a very important point here is to a lot of people, as they're trying to sort out these questions and what the Articles of Confederation are all about, they emphasize the idea that Americans' first and foundational constitution is the Declaration of Independence. And then the Articles of Confederation and then the U.S. Constitution is providing a framework of governance on top of that. But understanding what the Declaration of Independence did will help fill in a lot of the gaps and teach you how to interpret what was actually created. So a bunch of the nationalists, even after Thomas Burke has seemingly revolutionized the Articles of Confederation, claim that a lot of the premises that had informed Dickinson's draft have not gone away. They read the provisions that Burke added in a much more limited way and say, sure, we can't assume that any power that the states originally had has been given to Congress unless it's expressly delegated. But it actually turns out there's a whole nother set of powers that the states never originally had control over. Powers of inherent national concern that the Declaration of Independence automatically gave to the Continental or Confederation Congress. So a whole bunch of people in the mid-1780s say, yes, we need a new constitution, but not to give the national government more power, to ensure that it can use a lot of the powers that it already has that Dickinson's draft tried to formalize that are based in the Declaration of Independence. There's a reason Abraham Lincoln, on the eve of the Civil War, will tell this grand epic story of American union, of perpetual union that traces it back to the Continental Association and the Articles of Confederation and sees the U.S. Constitution as just a modification thereof. I think that would be less deeply rooted in American experience and cultural habits if they hadn't gone through this extended period of governing without formal authority. It teaches them that there is some unwritten Constitution of Union, that the Articles of Confederation or the Constitution are only in key respects formalized. And it's all because Americans, in this very amusing way, do things backwards. They govern, and then they explain how governance works and what its legal basis is. And we shouldn't downplay that. That is a huge legacy of life under the Articles. This period, 1777 to 1781, there is no Articles of Confederation, legally speaking, but there very much is in the working habits of how the Congress is governing. And that never, ever disappears from American life.
Well, let's move into our next segment, 1776 in context. So now that we're in the midst of the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, how do you think we should view the Articles of Confederation? Now, many historians point out that the Articles of Confederation government had many faults, and most of the scholars who study the Confederation period will use this Constitution as a stepping stone to the Constitution, rather than as a revolutionary form of government, rather than situating the Articles of Confederation into their own time. So 250 years later, Jane and Jonathan, how do you think we should view the Articles of Confederation and its place within the American Revolution?
Yeah, so I think my last answer in a lot of ways was beginning to speak to this. Then rather than see the Articles of Confederation as this foolish misstep that the Constitution helps correct for, as this sort of curiosity, this blip that happened, but it's just a small footnote. We should instead recognize that it provokes the central debate of all of American political life. Whether at the end of the day, the United States is a whole and the parts are subordinate to that. You know, the states are real and they exist and they have certain privileges and authority. But at the end of the day, the United States of America picks out a single indivisible thing defined by a single legal, political, cultural entity called the people of the United States. Or is the foundational premise of the whole thing that there is this sort of reserved space of local control, and the whole was created by the parts, and the whole should be subordinate to the parts. The Articles of Confederation is the first and a very crucial chapter in that debate that never goes away, and is the debate that is prosecuted with great ferocity on the eve of the Civil War. That is exactly what they're talking about. And it harkens back to the days of the Articles of Confederation and what it did or did not do and how the Constitution did or did not change them. So rather than seeing it as sort of a blip or a mistake or something that's sort of wiped away, instead see it as this crucial chapter in this unfolding story of not just political and constitutional development, but Americans having to come to terms with the distribution of sovereignty in the union they've created and what that means culturally for who they are. Patrick Henry famously pronounces at the First Continental Congress, we are all Americans now, differences between Virginians and Pennsylvanians should be washed away. Well, to what extent is that ultimately true? And to what extent does it have limitations? To call back to something Jane mentioned earlier, the American Revolution is partly fought because Americans think the British are essentially right when they say sovereignty is indivisible. At the end of the day, there has to be some sort of final entity or institution that gets to say what is what. And either the king in parliament has that power in the British Empire or not. If Americans would like to be exempt from that, then they're essentially independent. The sort of problem of imperium and imperio, a state within a state. Americans then recreate the exact problem that they've tried to escape. They have a whole and they have parts, and it's not obvious how they fit together. And initially, they just try to ignore the implications of that, but eventually you can't. And we learn a lot about that never to disappear question if we take the Articles of Confederation and the debates over it seriously, rather than seeing it as something that's just a mistake and then it's corrected for. No, the central problem of the Articles remains the central problem of the Constitution, which remains the central problem today when the federal government claims that it can do things in particular states, or when Congress tries to pass a big piece of national legislation and people challenge it on the grounds that it violates the powers of the national government. It's all that central question of what are we at the end of the day? Is the United States of America one thing, or is it a collection of states that have come together for particular purposes?
Yeah, and I guess I'd like to go back a little bit to Jonathan's, what he mentioned about the unwritten constitution or the constitution of the people, small c constitution, how a body politic is formed. Because as we talked about earlier, with the farmers' letters, Dickinson planted the seed of the idea of the American people. And then with the planting of this idea, from that point on, and I guess I would maybe want to downplay a little bit the significance of the Declaration of Independence for this thing, because what the Declaration of Independence was doing was just articulating something that was already in process. The Declaration of Independence didn't create anything from whole cloth. Neither did it finish anything. Independence was a process, and it began with the first rumblings of discontent by the colonists. Then there are these landmarks that we can kind of see going forward. So next, there's this kind of dawning of understanding of American identity. Then there's this articulation of it in the Declaration of Independence. And then this important, really important process that is happening during the Confederation period under this, yes, very flawed instrument, the Articles of Confederation, but important in the sense that we learned a lot about ourselves. So in Quaker constitutional theory, which is something that I've worked on and thought about for a long time, that's a good way to describe what Americans were experiencing. Quakers talk about the process of gathering a people, and the gathering of people is sort of an ongoing constitutional process of coming together as one people. And the Articles of Confederation really taught us a lot about ourselves and what we needed to construct in order to survive as a people. And then we get into when it became very clear with Shays' Rebellion that things were at a crisis point and we couldn't actually function under the Articles anymore. And then we had the Annapolis Convention, which was sort of a first abortive attempt to fix the Articles. Representatives from only a few states came together. They immediately named John Dickinson as the president or chairman and thought about, well, like, how can we fix our problems of trade and navigation on the Mississippi? Okay, well, we can't really do anything if we don't have representatives from all the states. So we really need to do something bigger and better. And let's have a convention in the summer of 1787. And going into that, Dickinson did not necessarily want to overthrow the Articles. He wanted to amend them. But I think he saw that it didn't really matter whether we amended the Articles or threw them out entirely and started over, because we were already a people. We were already functioning as a people. We already had an unwritten constitution. And so we just had to create something that would articulate what we were already doing and the powers that the Congress already kind of had or should have enhanced, and getting that down on paper with an amendment clause, like in the Pennsylvania Constitution, so it could be adjusted as we learned more about ourselves. And so the whole process of American history is us learning more about ourselves so we can make the sorts of changes that we need to make to adjust our government to suit our needs without losing sight of the fundamental principles that launched us in the first place. So yeah, we can't just throw out the Articles of Confederation and say, oh, well, they were imbecile. This is what they said at the time. They're imbecile. And so we should just ignore them and move on, because then we lose one of the most important moments we have where we learned about ourselves in order to fix the problems that ailed us. So yeah, I think it's great that we give attention to the Articles because, we're not done learning, and we actually might be able to learn something about ourselves today if we study the Confederation period for the flaws that it had and the challenges that it served up to us as a people and how we actually overcame them.
Well, Jane and Jonathan, before we conclude, would you tell us what's next for you? Jane, it feels like you just came out with your new biography on John Dickinson, penman of the founding. So what new aspect of Dickinson's life are you working on now?
Well, one really exciting thing that Jonathan and I are both working on is that As I am continuing to work on the John Dickinson Writings Project and process his papers and try to get them published so that everybody has access to them, several new Dickinson documents have come to light. They are documents from the summer of 1775 that he wrote about what was going on in Congress. These documents are a couple of letters and a piece of draft legislation that he wrote, and they shed light like never before on what was happening in Congress and the efforts that he went to try to get reconciliation with Britain. And so Jonathan and I are working on these documents and writing essays along with several other scholars that will be published this July in the William and Mary Quarterly. So I invite members of the audience to seek those out because they are fabulous documents and these essays are going to be really exciting, I think. So that's one thing I'm working on right now. Also trying to secure lost funding for the John Dickinson Writings Project and keeping it afloat to make sure that we can finish Volume 5, which takes us up to mid-1774, and continue working on Volume 6, which takes us into 1776 and through 1777. It would be a shame if we lost funding just as we're publishing the documents for the 250th.
And Jonathan, what are you working on now?
Well, in addition to the very exciting project on the discovery of these new Dickinson documents that Jane alluded to, my next book is what I'm calling The Forgotten History of the Preamble to the U.S. Constitution, essentially trying to understand why the preamble once mattered in the sense it was considered a crucial feature of constitutional interpretation, had political and legal significance, and how that went away. It essentially became what it is now, pleasing rhetorical flourish that precedes the beginning of the Constitution. And a crucial part of the story here is things we've been talking about today and that Jane was just speaking about in one of her recent answers. The preamble begins, "We the people of the United States," and then talks about a series of reasons why this entity, the people of the United States, are ordaining and establishing this Constitution of the United States. It therefore is very much about how people thought about this concept of the people of the United States, what had established it, where it had come from, what it was rooted in, very much rooted in not just the Declaration of Independence, but also all the activities of revolutionary governance that had unfolded to that point. A crucial chapter of this is how people understood that idea that ultimate authority in the United States was not a set of different peoples, the peoples of the United States, but the people of the United States informed John Dickinson's draft of the Articles of Confederation, and especially those who defended a more nationalistic reading of it thereafter. I'm very struck by the crucial ways in which they emphasize this idea that we are the single thing called the people of the United States first, and only other things later. And this is not often seen as a crucial chapter in American constitutional history, and I'm trying to explain why, as I see it in the late 18th and early 19th century, it was.
If we have more questions about the Articles of Confederation, John Dickinson, or the work of the Second Continental Congress, where's the best place for us to get in contact with you so we can pose those questions?
I can be found probably most easily at the project website, which is jdproject.org, or at my personal website, which is drjanecalvert.org.
In my case, you can visit my Stanford faculty webpage, easily accessed by going to the History Department webpage. And you can find my work email there, but also you can go to my personal website, jonathanganapp.com.
Jane Calvert and Jonathan Ganapp, thank you for helping us better understand this third piece of Richard Henry Lee's Virginia Resolution of June 7, 1776, and for taking us through the early history of the Articles of Confederation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
What did it take for 13 very different states to come together during their war for independence to create a new government from scratch? As Jane and Jonathan made clear, the Articles of Confederation was not the naive blunder of a constitution that it's often made out to be. Instead, it was a serious, creative, and often improvised attempt to build a federal union among 13 sovereign states. Now, John Dickinson's draft constitution tried to give the nation a strong center. His draft vested Congress with real power over the states, envisioned a central government capable of arbitrating interstate disputes and coordinating foreign policy, and it even extended religious freedom to women. But the Second Continental Congress stripped out much of what John Dickinson had envisioned for the new nation. Delegates in Congress feared that giving their new national government strong centralized power might be akin to trading one distant overbearing power for another. And so the Committee of the Whole reversed Dickinson's distribution of power and sent most of the power back to the states, until what took effect in March 1781 was a weak government that lacked the power to tax or do much more than make recommendations to the states. And yet, as Jonathan argued, we should resist the temptation to write off the Articles of Confederation as a footnote to the Constitution. The Articles provoked and began the central debate of American political life. How much power should the national government hold, and how much power should remain with each state? This debate did not end with a constitution, as we're still asking these same questions today. Now, over the past 3 episodes, we've explored how independence happened. We started with the creation of Richard Henry Lee's Virginia Resolution and its introduction to Congress on June 7, 1776. Plus, we followed its 3 provisions: the Declaration of Independence, the Model Treaty, and the Articles of Confederation. Now, what we found in our exploration is that independence was never a single act or a single document. It was a process, a messy, contested, and deeply human process that stretched from county courthouses in Virginia up and down the North American eastern seaboard, and all the way to the halls of Versailles and beyond. 250 years later, the questions the founders grappled with: who is included in our shared national values of freedom and equality? How can a nation become treaty-worthy? And how much power should a national government have and wield? These are still questions we grapple with today, which shows us that the work of independence and of building a sovereign, independent nation didn't just happen in 1776. It's the work that each generation takes on, and that is still ongoing today. You can find more information about Jane, Jonathan, their books, plus notes, links, and a transcript for everything we talked about today, all in the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/445. Friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts, so if you enjoy Ben Franklin's World, please tell your friends and family about it. Production assistance for this podcast comes from Joseph Edelman, Karen Wolf, and Morgan McCullough. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Finally, Jonathan challenged us to see the Articles of Confederation not as a failure, but as the origin point of American political life and argument. So what do you think that this first Constitution reveals about what the founders valued and feared in a national government? I'd really love to hear what you think. Liz at benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of Clio Digital Media, and support for this episode comes from the Massachusetts Historical Society, the first historical society founded in the United States in 1791.